The Climate Change Education and Outreach webinar. And again, my name is Kathy Warbeck. I'm the Education Director with ACE, is what we usually shorten, the Alberta Council for Environmental Education, based in Edmonton. And I know I've met some of you, and the people on the call range from northern Alberta to Calgary to different parts of the province. So the webinar, I did mention you could introduce yourself using the chat feature, which is found on your bottom menu bar. And I'm really going to give an overview of the climate change education and outreach work that we've done. We're going to really dig into what is excellent climate change education, the resource we developed to support our work. And I'm going to share some resources you can use to better understand local impacts for your region. And like I said, at the end, we'll have some time to answer questions. So who is the Alberta Council for Environmental Education? We are a nonprofit charity based in Alberta, and we are a staff of about 5 people. Gareth Thompson is in the baseball cap in the right-hand corner. He's our education director. Christina Pickles is our program manager. In the center with the beautiful sun halo is Laura Hughes. She started on as a youth coordinator and moving into a program coordinator role. On the bottom right is Diane Kashuba. She's our fund development manager. I'm in the picture. It looks like I've changed my hair color. And then we have our board of directors. That's a picture of the group. And they come from various parts of the province and various walks of life as well. And our mission is really to work collaboratively to advance environmental education in Alberta. And in that work, we really do cover that environment and energy connection as well. So especially in a province such as Alberta, having that environment and energy pieces kind of work hand in hand is very important. And so this was kind of a, what do you think when you hear the term climate change education? And so I'm going to encourage you to type in one word in the chat feature. So what do you think when you hear about climate change education? Okay, so we're seeing needed, apathy, rejected, conflict. So those are some of the words that people have put in there. And I'd say that that is definitely very true on what a lot of people think about when they hear the word climate change education, is that apathy. There's lots of conflict around it. Neglected, that maybe not enough is being done. And then there's always that question of what kind of images should we show our different audiences, whether it's a K-12 audience, which is grades K-12, or public education. There's these kind of images, you know, that it's the end of the world, and, you know, that very, if we don't do anything, you know, the world is not going to continue. So that's the one way that we can certainly do things. And this is a photo that I often use to show how most folks react when climate change is mentioned, and that's often the deer in the headlights. And sometimes if we're having conversations with colleagues or family, it's kind of that, oh no, someone brought up climate change. Are we really going to talk about it? Because it's often a very polarized conversation. And then, is education about climate change optimized in our Alberta schools? And then this is Patrick Duke. He's a University of Calgary student, and he founded Students on Sustainability. And when we first were meeting Patrick and wondering why he had formed this, he said, well, when it comes to climate change, students in Alberta aren't given the tools they need to combat this global challenge our generation faces. the school system just isn't providing those skills. So he graduated in 2012, and he said when he went to university and some of the things that he was working on, he didn't feel that it had prepared him for that. So Students on Sustainability is something that he created, where university students are going out and doing presentations in schools in Calgary. So it's a very volunteer program, and we've kind of helped get him started. We started this work kind of last year, probably more July, well, June, it was about the same time last year. And so we started with a needs assessment, and we've pulled together, some of the resources that we've been using, and some of the presentations that we've done and have invited other people to do in some of the workshops. So that's the website. If you go on abcee.org and just go under our work, you'll find Climate Education and Outreach, but that's the full URL. And so last year we did do a needs assessment and kind of what are the needs, challenges, and recommendations from Alberta teachers, and 221 teachers responded to the survey. The Alberta Teachers Association actually sent it out to their teachers, so that we got a fairly good response. And so some of the barriers that teachers put forward was having to find their own resources. So just taking the time, they know that there's good resources out there, but just taking that time to find those resources. They also said funding to engage students in authentic learning experiences. So sometimes those experiences need to happen outside of the school, and just having funding to do that. And limited quality educational resources. So even when they find the resources, it might not be for their grade or age level or their fit in with their curriculum. So those were some of their barriers. And then what do they need? They really wanted opportunities for experiential learning beyond the classroom. And I know many of you provide those opportunities for students, especially in some of our natural settings. But how do we do that when it comes to things like energy and climate change and some of those other topics as well? And finding those curriculum and grade specific resources from external organizations. And some access to climate change experts, and whether again that is through TEDx talks or webinars, or just having being able to bring people into their classroom. That was another big piece for them. So I think even helping teachers find a really credible TEDx or other experts to chat with is really important. And then we also asked groups that do environmental education, whether that's through the nonprofit world like CPAWS or Alberta Tomorrow, some of the folks on the call here today, or government, Alberta Parks, Parks Canada. So what do you need to effectively incorporate climate change into your programs? And so this was a survey we did as well. And so tools and techniques for effectively engaging our audience on this topic, best practices for climate change education and outreach, and connections with other educators to learn best how to do this. So we had about 88 agency folks respond to that survey. And from that, we then said, well, something that could be really useful is answering the question, what is excellent climate change education, or what are some of those best practices? So we put this piece together, and just to kind of hear from some of the young folks that we have worked with. In the foreword, you'll find things like, we're the last generation who have the chance to combat climate change. If we don't do that, then nothing else matters. And this is from Steve Lee. He's 25 years old. He's a youth policy advocate to the United Nations and executive director of Foundation for Environmental Stewardship. And so he started the 3% Project to mobilize 1 million Canadians around climate change, and that's kind of 3% of Canada's population, that mobilizing 1 million youth. And he's doing 5 national tours to engage with high schools and universities. And then when it comes to climate change, the antidote to despair is action. This was a grade 12 student who we were doing some work with, and just was really talking about being kind of overwhelmed and those feelings of despair. So who is this document for then? Well, we wrote it to support the work of classroom teachers and environmental education groups that support K-12. And it does touch also a little bit on that public education and outreach as well. And how did we create it? Well, we worked with Nathan Skreisbeck, who was a graduate student at the time. And so he reviewed and summarized over 140 peer-reviewed refereed journal articles. And then we also did, went through some non-academic publications and K-12 teaching resources from governments, nonprofit. And we also pulled some of the practitioner best practices, those that have been working in this field for a long time. And then we had 10 external reviewers kind of review this work, and we've continued to grow it and add to it. It's not like you can come up with the best practices and then they never change. There's always more research and things that comes along. So we're really gonna, I did send out to you this morning an email that had the link to access the What is Excellent Climate Change Education. So again, it is on our website, and it is on that climate education and outreach webpage. So hopefully you've kind of downloaded that and can either access it as we go through. And the first part of the document talks about framing. And so this is on page 5 of the document. And this is really that, let's focus on the solution space versus the problem space. So climate change is both, it's the problem space and the solution space. But when we are in that problem space, it becomes the very doom and gloom. Whereas when we work in that solution space, it's much more positive and generates hope. And I'll touch on that a lot more as we go through. There is a lot of climate fatigue. It's like, oh, we've heard about climate change forever, and it's nothing's happening, nothing's changing. So how can we reframe climate change? And this is maybe not just coming at this from an environmental perspective, but it can be a social and economic sustainability piece, that economic opportunity, future jobs, that connection to public health. So when we can connect it to a broader piece, it doesn't just become an environmental piece as well. And again, I'll touch on this in a bit. And really embracing who we are as a culture. So we do have to recognize that we are living and working in Alberta, and Alberta has this, very proud history of being an energy powerhouse and an energy leader. We're very innovative, entrepreneurial, and this has been, a real integral part of our past. So how do we honor that and embrace who we are as a culture and say that we can continue to be an energy powerhouse, but in a much more low carbon future? So really kind of making that connection. And a lot of this work came through having George Marshall, who's with the Climate Outreach Group in the United Kingdom. He came over and we did some workshops, the Pembina Institute, Alberta Eco Trust, City of Calgary, City of Edmonton. A group of folks came together to bring him over, and he really talked about, that framing that works with your audiences. And I'll touch again a little bit more on this later on, because he's continuing some of that work here in Alberta. This is a piece that we use to kind of show how, the broader pieces of environmental education, how do they connect to climate change education? Or how do we find, when we're doing something about nature connection, how does that connect to climate change? So we use this tree as a way to kind of show that, there's different limbs of the tree, and there's all these different pieces, but they all are kind of interconnected. And some of that will come through in some of the research that we found. So again, just in looking at your work and looking at this tree, which limb resonates more with you, and then which branch? And you can just type that in the chat as well. And I'm just going to go back and okay, so we've got some energy conservation. Conservation, energy, a few others, and conservation. Okay. So you can kind of see sometimes, and what I found too in Alberta, sometimes there's a lot happening maybe on the conservation side, a little bit on the, you know, a fair bit on the outdoors, and some in the energy side, but not maybe as much in some of the other areas. And it's not saying that we have to have the same amount, but just there are those differences. And one of the other pieces that really came out of the research was kind of, there's really 4 themes that can come together for effective climate change education. And this was from a very thorough kind of, they had done a thorough systemic review and looked at different programs and what really did work. And one of the things they really talked about was, especially climate change is a little bit, well, quite a bit different than other environmental education, just because it has a lot more people come to this with very much kind of preconceived ideas. And so engaging in deliberative discussions is a piece that they feel often isn't done in environmental education, but is really important for climate change education. And this is the, how do we know what we know? So it's understanding that people come with those preconceived ideas, but how did they come to that knowing what they know? And having students practice making the claim of what they know, and then having them, you know, work to support that claim with evidence. So it really helps transform those personal beliefs into reasoned views. So that was a really, for me in doing this work, that was a really important piece for me to really understand how climate change is different maybe than other environmental education, and that we don't often give that space to have those type of conversations. Interacting with science and scientists, and this is just having access to data and really having discussions on how scientific knowledge is constructed. So really getting down to that understanding. And then addressing those misconceptions. And they said that you could do a lot of talking about the knowing, but unless students actually get to do some of that experiential learning or experiments, kind of more the constructivist type learning, then those misconceptions often don't get changed. And then really working with their school and community really helps, again, kind of move those personal beliefs into a broader context and empowers them and gives them that hope. So we'll go into a bit more of that as well. So climate change, what's in a word? So climate, it really focuses on the science behind climate change. It addresses the weather and climate systems. It could include impacts on natural systems, where the change is incorporating that social and humanities expert. It's the teaching about and for change. And so when it comes to the change, there's kind of 6 steps that we can look at it with this as well. The issues analysis, community and personal decision-making, political processes, social justice, intercultural sensitivity, and competence and behavior change. So just kind of, it's kind of unpacking those two words a little bit. So remember the audience. Again, this is important, especially in our K-12 system. And Dr. David Sobel is a professor in the Faculty of Education at Antioch University in the US. And he's done a lot of work on place-based education. He comes at his work from a geography background. And he's just said, no tragedies before grade 4. If we want children to flourish, we need to give them time to connect with nature and love the earth before we ask them to save it. And he just found through some of his work, especially in the US, kind of in the earlier times of environmental education, when there was a lot of pollution, and you know, in the US they had rivers that were on fire from pollution, and you know, teachers were bringing these in in some of the younger years. And he said he wrote a whole article on ecophobia, that it actually made children fear the environment and think it was ugly and messy, rather than getting them to appreciate it. So just looking at, you know, kind of the K-6 is really building that environmental appreciation and sensitivity and those ecological concepts. So especially the K-3 is just really creating that love of nature, our connection to the land, you know, the air, the water, really understanding that. You can still bring in actions at that age, but it's more the modeling. We do this, it's just the way we do things. We recycle, we turn off lights. You don't have to bring in the doom and gloom. We just do this because we take care of our home, just like we take care of other people. So you can still do actions in the early years. It's just you don't have to bring in and all the other aspects with it. And then as they get, you know, in those middle years in high schools, definitely the issues, the values clarification, the investigation and action skills. And that's where our students, especially as they, you know, move into the high school, they really have that social kind of connection. They want to make a difference. They want to be part of their community. So really, you can really build on that. And then we get into some of the design elements, and we broke these down into 3 categories. They all kind of, you can see I'm repeating stuff. They all are interconnected and overlapped as well. But one of the big things that came out of the work was that learners act because of how they feel, not what they know. And I'll continue with this thread a little bit later too. So really thinking about, we often do the head, the knowing part, but you know, really thinking about how do you engage the heart and the hands. If you're looking at this from a First Nations or want to make that connections with First Nations way of being, knowing and doing, you can look at you know, kind of the 4 areas of, you know, air, fire, water, and earth. Action on climate change must be both personal and public. This is a quote from Al Gore saying, "It is not enough to change light bulbs. We must also change public policy." And yes, thank you, Jewel, for the medicine wheel teachings. And so he, if you're looking in the chat, you can see some notes in there as well as we go throughout. So this is, for me, this really resonates too, that it's personal and public action. I think we've talked about climate change as this big complex thing and everybody has to do their part. But then it's like, but if you just change the light bulbs, you know, that's going to make the difference. And people see through that. They know that that's not going to be enough. So they're like, you know, we're not going to do that because it's not going to make a big enough difference. So they also have to see that public policy is moving forward as well. And I sat in on a webinar from folks in the US, and they were really talking about that public policy piece and how important it is, and that even our decision makers don't often understand. They were talking about clean energy policy and things like that, that they often really don't understand how those economic pieces work with clean energy policy. So we really have to do a lot of work on that public policy piece. What are the policies that are going to make a difference, and how do we make that easy for people to understand as well? This is that, does knowledge to action work? And I talked a little bit about this. So no, there is a huge disconnect between information and action. So like I said, we've often just engaged the head, but we have to engage the heart and hands as well. And this is from one of the articles, really brought this out too. And this was with 9th graders. And that understanding of climate change and perspectives, it did not significantly predict students' willingness to act. So even they knew about it, it didn't lead them towards acting. And so a big part of action is teaching action skills. And I mentioned this a little bit, but that kind of issue identification, problem solving, critical thinking. How do you engage and mobilize a community to do something together, finding the resources to support what you're doing, developing those partnerships, and helping students really practice that. So again, really moving beyond just the knowing. And that when we do that action, it should be personally relevant and meaningful. And I'll touch on this again, but really making it about their local place, about their local environment. And we kind of talk about, these are the things that you can do when it comes to climate change. You can carpool, you can use public transport, or, changing light bulbs. But sometimes we forget to help people with the how. So, and that's a little bit of that action skills is a bit of that how. So if you tell people, take public transport, do they know how to access good information on, how do I do a bus schedule? How do I find which buses? How much does it cost? We just assume that people easily know how to do that. So just putting some of the how with it. And that action is, I think, the piece that really gives hope. And I'm sure you've heard, if you've sat in on any ACE sessions, I'm sure you've heard the quote, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And this is from Dr. David Orr, a renowned biologist. And it's just that when we roll up our sleeves and we do things, it gives us hope. So that's just that action and hope go really well hand in hand. And connection to the environment is a predictor of an individual's willingness to act. So, all those, this is where I say those connections to conservation and nature and the programs that do that are really important foundational pieces for climate change education. So this is that whole getting students outdoors, connecting them to their local place. And it's also, I think, outdoor education can really form that valuable Velcro onto which other complex concepts can be more readily attached. So it's not just that connection to climate change. And here's another quote from Dr. David Sobel, that wet sneakers and muddy clothes are prerequisites for understanding the water cycle. And again, this is from him going into grade 4 classrooms. It seems to be grade 4, they learn about the water cycle. And he said, they can tell me the whole water cycle, evaporation, precipitation, condensation. They can tell me the whole thing. But he would have them draw pictures. And he would say the kids would draw pictures of water running uphill, because they had learned it all in a textbook, had never gone outside to really explore, how does water work in our environment. So just getting out and seeing our environment and connecting to it. This is another action piece, and this comes from some of the George Marshall work. Make climate change us, here and now, not there, them, and then. And I think this is the overuse of the polar bears, which doesn't help people connect to climate change in our own community. So just making it much more place-based, and I'll come back to this towards the end of this as well. So it's really constructing that compelling narrative, leading to a positive resolution. So helping to describe the world we want to see instead of kind of what's happening. Where do we want to be? What type of world do we want? I think is a very, very powerful way to help with some of that. And I talked about using Alberta's public narrative. And so this is the project that Alberta Eco Trust has been working on. And again, it's in partnership with a lot of folks, and it's the Alberta Narratives Project. And George Marshall has been here again and is working with folks on this. So I think there's at least 40 to 50 organizations that are working on this project. And so as a whole group, they're trying to come up with some narratives. And then all these groups are going out and doing focus groups with various audiences that they work with. So we're doing it, and we're talking to youth and teachers. And so this work is just happening right now. But from it, they want to create this set of energy climate narratives based on culture, values, and identities of Albertans, and to come up with some of the messages that can engage a wider spectrum of audiences. So Alberta Eco Trust, you can see the URL there. And you can join this Climate Connect community, and then you'll just get little updates of other things that are happening, or, hey, check out this. And then when this work is released or announced, or when they're ready to share it, we'll definitely be putting it on our website and letting people know about that as well. So just watch for that, because I think it can really help all of us in our work. Responsible climate change education also helps our children learn how to think instead of what to think. So we shouldn't be going in with education programs telling them what to think, but really helping them how to think. So again, it really needs to allow learners to critically think about, defend and extend their ideas, explore where their ideas came from, unpack their own assumptions and perspectives in the context of sound science, and consider other perspectives. So that's kind of those 4 themes I touched on at the very beginning. Really avoid that fear. The fears-based messaging does not encourage behavior change. It actually leads to dread, powerlessness, apathy, paralysis, some of those words that maybe we used at the beginning. And I'm going to show a little bit and talk a little bit more about when we use some of that, how do we get to that, really boxed into our identity and of how it's related to climate change. And with that fear comes we start distancing ourselves from those negative emotions, which makes us move away from action, where if we focus on the action, it helps give that feeling of hopefulness. So just, again, trying to avoid that fear. And when it comes, how do we do this in curriculum? For K-12, this is more for the K-12 audience. That cross-curricular is really important. So trying to not just talk about it in science, which ends up being more about the knowing about climate change, but where we get it into the social studies, language arts, math, that's where we can get into more of the doing side of things as well, and moving it beyond just a science and environmental issue. That systems thinking is really important. Our Earth is a system. We're part of that system. Energy is a system. So just helping students understand systems thinking is another thing that we can really help when we're doing with this. And Jennifer, I know Alberta Tomorrow with your land use stuff, it really does bring in some of that systems thinking, because they get to play with that system a little bit and see how things impact land use especially. So yeah, so things like that are really important. This is an example of, it's a resource we worked on with the Environmental Law Center, and this is called Woolly Thinking. And it's just helping students see broader connections to climate change. So they have to, there's all these chairs and they've got this ball of wool, and each of the chairs has a different thing on it, like biological diversity, global economy, arms trade, human rights, and trade in general, democracy, and lots of other things. And then climate change is one of them. And they have to find a connection from their topic to climate change. And then it just starts all of these discussion pieces. So again, just thinking things in a bigger context. Another thing that I think, we've all spent more time in the mitigation space when it comes to climate change, and especially with current curriculum, there isn't really a lot of talk about adaptation, but just how do we expand, to make those connections between adaptation, mitigation, and building that resiliency. So on the right of this little infographic is that's mitigation, and on the left is adaptation. And then there's that sweet spot in the middle where you can come up with actions that both help adaptation and mitigation. And this infographic is from Let's Talk Energy. And they have lots of infographics and lesson plans. You can just Google Let's Talk Energy. It's probably easier to find it that way, but some good things bringing this work forward. And just, as we work on adaptation, it reduces our vulnerability and helps us build resiliency. And I'd say, especially City of Calgary and City of Edmonton, they're working on their climate adaptation and resilience plans right now. And I know the City of Edmonton is actually right now doing engagement with Edmontonians around adaptation and resilience. So that you'll see, I think, lots more work coming forward on that. And we talk about evaluation. I'm not sure if that's really the word I would use, but I think the importance of the work that we all do and telling our stories is so important, not just from an evaluation perspective, but for the reason for you to tell your stories is, the teachers and students that you work with, and you really deserve that recognition for the work that you are doing and the change that it is making. It does help promote and kind of protect your program, because if you can show that your program and tell that story of the impact it has, the much easier it is, from within your organization and with those outside groups to see the value of that. It also inspires others to act. So I do like this quote: "The planet needs you to tell your story." So I think storytelling can be really, really effective, and it helps us move that social norm by having more stories out there. So if you have good stories to tell, what should be in your story? So highlighting those accomplishments, those outcomes. So what has changed, the benefits to the environment. Make it that us story. It's personal stories about Albertans and Alberta students or whoever your audience in Alberta is. And it shows that action on climate is possible, and that there can be high quality learning around climate change, and that it does give us hope. The other things in that document, Appendix C, it talks a little bit about kind of these organizations. So what do you think these have in common? Any guesses on what you think these organizations have in common? You can type it in the chat box. They're high carbon energy, oil and gas, Oil companies working on becoming energy companies. Ah, interesting. Yep. And one thing that we have found is that these were all the groups, the top row were the groups that really came out in support of Alberta's climate leadership plan when they announced it. I think they were on the stage at that time, and that they all have significant policies to combat climate change. So yes, they're all oil and gas companies or energy companies, but they're also see the importance of the work in the climate leadership space as well. So one other thing I wanted to talk about, this is this work we kind of found after we had created the document, and we've put they're all points in the document. It may not be presented as this way, but this is from Espen Stoknes. He's educated as a psychologist, obviously from Norway, and he's organizational theory and a lecturer at the Norwegian School of Management. And so he's really, you know, from that psychological perspective, when we have that climate news, that doom and gloom, the flooding, and, you know, that the ice caps are melting, it really brings out the 5 Ds. So that distance, the doom, we start getting that dissonance of we don't know how to deal with this, you know, it's such a big complex thing, and it's kind of, I know I should be doing more, but I also have to drive. And so you get that dissonance happening, you get the denial, and then it really becomes a part of our identity as whether I'm a climate denier or I just can't do anything. It really, we become locked in that identity. And I'll just, some of the other things that you may find useful is this says climate change communication from Yale. They've also done this, you can get the same map for Canada, but this is the percentage of adults who think global warming is happening. And so you can see these are in that whole 40 to 60% range. So it's more than 50% of people in the US think that global warming is happening. And then when you ask them the question, what percentage of adults think global warming will harm them personally, it drops way down. So to me, this really talks to that disconnect between, yeah, global warming is happening, but it's happening somewhere else. It's happening to other people. It's not going to affect me personally. So I think there's that, it just illustrates that real disconnect. So you can find this on climatecommunication.yale.edu. And then when you scroll down to the latest work, they have these Yale climate opinion maps. And there's lots of different questions that they've got asked there that you can check. And this was just when Catherine Hayhoe was here with George Marshall when the city of Edmonton had the Cities and Climate Change Science Conference. She mentioned this and she said, so that is a real disconnect, you know, and again, we need to make it about us here and now. And so Per talks about switching those 5 Ds to the 5 S's. So that first one is that social, and so that is, it's about the us here and now, really making that. Supportive, this is kind of using that Alberta framing, connecting to other things like health, as showing the supportive sides of things. And as you're doing engagement, it has that little 3-to-1 ratio. If you do use a negative connotation about climate change, you have to include 3 positives. So it's just showing it in that supportive realm. Simple, this is the solution space, taking action. And it's really trying to find what are those simple actions that we can make that just become those default actions. Like there's just nothing, no other way of people to do things other than this is now the way that things are done. So you know, whether you could look at it through recycling or just simple actions. But then that become kind of a default. There's not a lot of choice to make that action. It's very easy because it's the only choice that they can make. The signal, this to me is a really important factor as well. This is that motivating feedback on how well we're doing to solve the problem. So this is real-time feedback, immediate. And I think this is the piece that we often forget about. We ask people to do things, they do make the change, but they never hear back on what difference did it make. So really putting that signal in there. And then the story, telling the positive narrative and those stories that are making change. So trying to focus on the 5 S's. And I'm just going to kind of show, this is a little video clip. It's Per talking about stuff, and I'm just going to show the beginning of this and the end of this, and it's a TED talk, so you can Google TED Apocalypse Fatigue, and you can find it if you want to watch the whole thing, because he'll go into the 5 S's and the 5 Ds. But we'll just start.
How do we get people engaged in solving global warming? I'd like to start with running 2 short experiments with you all. So your task is to notice if you feel any difference as I speak. Okay? Here we go. We are seeing rising carbon dioxide levels, now above 410 ppms. To avoid the RCP 8.5 scenario, we need rapid decarbonization. The global carbon budget for 66% likelihood to meet the 2-degree target is approximately 800 gigatons. Okay, now let me try something else. We are heading for an uninhabitable Earth. Monster storms, killer floods, devastating wildfires, crazy heat waves that will cook us under a blazing sun. 2017 is already so unexpectedly warm. It's freaking out climate scientists. We have a 3-year window to cut emissions. 3 years. If not, we'll soon live in a boiling Earth, a hellhole. Okay. So, now your task. How did these ways of speaking make you feel? The first, detached maybe, or just confused? What's this guy talking about? The other, fearful, or just numb? So again, the question asked, how do we get people engaged in solving global warming? And why don't these 2 ways of communicating work? You see, the biggest obstacle to dealing with climate disruptions lies between your ears.
So that's kind of the 5 Ds, right? And then I'm just going to go to the end here, and he kind of changes that to more about the 5 S's.
There's another way too I'd like to share with you. It starts with reimagining climate itself as the living air. Climate isn't really about some abstract, distant climate far away from us. It's about this air that surrounds us. This air you can feel in this room too. The air that moves right now in your nostrils. This air is our Earth's skin. It's amazingly thin compared to the size of the Earth and the cosmos it shields us from. Far thinner than the skin of an apple compared to its diameter. It may look infinite when we look up, but the beautiful, breathable air is only like 5 to 7 miles thin, a fragile wrapping around a massive ball. Inside this skin, We're all closely connected. The breath that you just took contained around 400,000 of the same argon atoms that Gandhi breathed during his lifetime. Inside this thin, fluctuating, unsettled film, all of life is nourished, protected, and held. It insulates and regulates temperatures in a range that is just right for water and for life as we know it. And mediating between the blue ocean and black eternity, the clouds carry all the billions of tons of water needed for the soils. The air fills the rivers, stirs the waters, waters the forests. With the global weirding of the weather, there are good reasons for feeling fear and despair. Yet, we may first grieve today's sorry state and losses, and then turn to face the future with sober eyes and determination. The new psychology of climate action lies in letting go, not of science, but of the crutches of abstractions and doomism, and then choosing to tell the new stories. These are the stories of how we achieve drawdown, the reversing of global warming. These are the stories of the steps we take as peoples, cities, companies, and public bodies in caring for the air in spite of strong headwinds. These are the stories of the steps we take because they ground us in what we are as humans. Earthlings inside this living air. Thank you.
So we'll chat about that at the end, but just that different framing of how we talk about it. I don't know, I mean, he used the term global warming, you know, once or twice, but it was not really about that. It was about our air and the air we breathe and our fragile atmosphere of the skin of our planet. So we'll talk about that at the end. And we just wanted to recognize, obviously with the work that we do, we need funders that allows us to go out and do this work. So the Alberta Government, Environment and Parks, and the Suncor Energy Foundation have provided funding to help us do this work. And then on our website, there's resources at the bottom. And then, so if there's work that you want to do about understanding climate change terminology and data, this is from the Climate Resilience Consultants. And so there's little videos on trends and variability, spatial variability, understanding models, and unpacking RCPs. RCPs are something that it's taken me a while to figure out. But when we had the City of Edmonton and City of Calgary folks come out and talk about the work they were doing, they have all these RCPs, and it's basically different kind of percentage points of how much you know, carbon dioxide is going to increase, and then what do those models look like if we have these different scenarios. So it's just a way for them to look at different scenarios. But just understanding that. So there's lots of information there just on that piece. And then if you want to better understand local impacts, again, Climate Resilience Consulting, there's the Prairie Climate Forum, I can't remember the name as well, but the Climate Atlas is another great one. And then we also have the presentations from the City of Calgary and City of Edmonton that were you know, really, really good as well. And we have the one from the City of Edmonton, because the City of Edmonton just did their Change for Climate. That's how they've kind of used all this, how are we going to talk about climate change? And they went back and forth on whether they should use the word climate, but they've done Change for Climate, and they've got some videos out that they've used advertising and stuff. So there's just some of those resources. The Climate Resilience Consulting, it has 2 maps of Alberta that show kind of from now, it's a progression over time and showing temperature or climate changes. And then there's a precipitation one as well. So you can kind of see a little bit more locally. And Climate Atlas allows you to check different things and get more down to your area in the province of Alberta. So just to share those with you as well. And then there's my contact information again. I did put it in the chat. You've got my email already.